Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see such a packed hall. My name is Sue Leonard. I am a ghostwriter and a journalist with the Irish Examiner. And it is a great pleasure to be here this evening with Michael Harding. I thought it was such a lovely surprise, really, that his memoirs, both his memoirs, were incredible bestsellers. They were in the top bestseller list for ages, which I think says something nice about the Irish people, because publishers are pushing, what it's like. At first it's sort of 20 Shades of Grey, or however many shades of grey it was, and then it's Girl on the Train, or a title with girl in, and publishers think you have to have the latest thing. And then you get some, wonderful, well-written memoir, as Michael would describe it, about nothing, which is one way of putting it. It's about everything. And it does so well, and I think that is just fantastic. But then you look at Michael's record of awards, and it seems that everything this man touches just turns to gold. So I should imagine it was no surprise to him. The Stuart Parker Award for Theatre. The RTE Award for Excellence in the Arts. Hennessy Literary Awards for short stories, Best Actor and the Dublin Theatre Fringe Award, nominated for the Best Play, and then the Non-Fiction Award for Staring at Lakes. I mean, he's just so talented in every single area, and he's also the most wonderful talker. So I think it is really going to be the most fantastic evening. He's talking about, incidentally, the third in his... We've had the two memoirs, and this is the third one, which is coming out in the autumn, did you say? And it's called Talking to Strangers. So he's going to read a little bit from it, and then we're going to be in conversation, and we will then open it out to the audience. So a big welcome for Michael Harding.
I do everything wrong all my life. The only thing that's made me kind of interesting to people is that I admit it. I just completely feck up everything, including this reading, because I just realized a minute ago that I'd come with the wrong glasses. You see, I had two sets like this, and one is for looking at you and the other is for reading at you. But then some Egypt told me I'd look better in these. And I'm going round for the past 3 days like I had two little television screens stuck in between my nose. And they're all right, except that it meant that I had two silver pairs sitting on the desk in my bedroom, and of course I took the wrong ones down. So I have to put these on top of the other ones to see the script. I'm not joking here. A problem early on in the flight. I write this memoir, which is coming to an end in this third volume, and it's really been a kind of a meditation on nothing and a journey inwards. I think as a writer, having done novels and having done plays, I felt the time had come that I was just a storyteller, but that the real story for me was the journey inside. In other words, that strange place where nothing happens and yet everything happens, where we're all confused. And so I write this terrible stuff, and I'll read you little bits of it. I regularly, in this new book, Talking to Strangers, what happens is my lady wife, who is a sculptor, Kathy Carmen is her name, and she's a very fine artist, and she went off to Poland. She's always going off to Poland. She's never at home. I had to learn how to use a washing machine for clothes. But it's really a problem. Anyway, she's away in Poland, and I tend then to get sick. I get chest infection, or I get worried or neurotic about something, and I go to the doctor. And then I start in the winter to get quite melancholic and down and depressed. And then she comes home, and then I'm fine. So anyway, this was one day in the winter. I was at the doctor's, There was a bright waiting room and an office for the receptionist, and there were 2 rooms down the corridor where the doctors sat behind clean desks with their laptops and stethoscopes at the ready, and their desks stacked with folders of intimate notes about patients' bodily functions. I sat in the corner of the waiting room, facing 2 other invalids opposite me. One was an elderly man with shaking hands and thick glasses and a chalk-white face. A bloodless old fella, like someone that has long ago renounced the pleasures of the world and retired to the solitude of his own psyche to become more spirit than flesh, a kind of living abstraction. The other invalid was a little woman with a red face. She had a tissue the size of a small towel on her lap, which she moved from hand to hand and, when necessary, to her nose. There was a talk show in full swing on the radio that sat on a ledge outside the secretary's office. The radio is an important device in a doctor's surgery. It keeps people who might know each other from falling into idle chat about their private ailments. Because in rural Ireland, the body is an absolutely isolated galaxy. And the radio also creates a kind of serenity in the waiting room, akin to the singing deacon in a church. The radio presenter was talking to a sex therapist and reading out problems that listeners had texted or mailed in. Apparently, some fella in his 60s who was having sex 4 or 5 times a week up until recently was now experiencing a downturn. And he was worried that once a week was an unnaturally low performance level. What should he do? The presenter asked the therapist. I tried to keep a solemn face by distracting myself with other thoughts. I tried to think of thrushes that had arrived in the garden that morning and were feeding under the trees. Maybe I should put out nuts for them. But I couldn't resist looking at the old man opposite me. For all I knew, he may have had a wonderful sex life. He may have performed for years on a daily basis, with sudden grace, endlessly surprising his beloved, like a little hawk that swoops with elegance on his little hen. But there was certainly no trace of any such adventures left in his body now. The therapist on the radio was explaining that sometimes orgasms can be hard to achieve, and that sometimes sexual pleasure is about more than just an orgasm. This caused the little fat lady to sneeze. A huge cloud of wet germs into her handkerchief. And in an aftermath of devastating chest movements, she coughed up phlegm, which her handkerchief swallowed as it emerged from her mouth. Does it take him any longer than normal to ejaculate? The therapist wanted to know. It may simply, she said, be an issue of age. I looked at the old woman and the man opposite me and wondered, when was the last time either of them had been on fire with desire? Which drew me into a small but pleasant remembrance of my own most recent orgasm a few days previously. But it did occur to me that everyone in the world must eventually arrive at what turns out to be their last orgasm. Does he wear glasses? The therapist. I didn't mean that. It was Ray Darcy, by the way. Does he wear glasses, the therapist on the wireless wanted to know. It sounded like an accusation, and I was slightly relieved that I had left my own glasses in the car. The little lady smiled across the room at me, as if we were all children listening to a fairy tale. And I was glad when the secretary called my name and I went down the corridor to the surgery, where the doctor listened to my lungs and concluded that I had an infection and needed antibiotics. So off I went to the pharmacy, handed in the prescription, and waited for a young lady in a white shop coat to fill it out. I was waiting just beside the counter, hovering over a display of men's toiletries, moistures, talcum powders, and deodorants. And there before me, within reach of my fingers, was a full shelf of condoms. Packages of 3, of 6, of 12. Normal, safe, and strong. And even condoms architecturally designed for extra pleasure, according to the labels. Eventually, the chemist gave me my little bottle of red and white amoxicillin capsules, and I went home and took to the bed with a Lemsip and the nostalgic sounds of Chopin's piano music oozing from the big speakers beneath the bed.
That was magic. That was absolute magic. Well done. You did sort of slightly mention there at the beginning of that why memoir, but when did your publisher approach you with the idea, or did you approach
of the memoir?
Of the memoir, yes.
It happened this way. As I say, I'm a storyteller, and I had done stories in theatre or in books about troubles in the clergy, the collapse of the institution, the darkness that ensued.
Yes.
And I also did stories, plays, books about the troubles in the north, because I had lived there and had a few traumatic experiences, right? Yeah. So my fiction was coming out of those places. But as I went on, I think in life, I felt that I had this idea of writing a kind of a chronicle of Midland life. Yes. I used to enjoy reading Mr. Pepys. Mr. Pepys' diary really kind of inspired me, because Mr. Pepys was in London like 400 years ago, and he saw huge important events, but he also adds in little things like, the wife is in foul humour today, or the dog died or something. And yes. I thought, that maybe there's a story that's not a big story, yes. that is a story of just like ordinary life. And I had this dream always of doing this big long chronicle, and somebody said to me one time, why don't you try and see, would the Irish Times take, we'll say 2 or 3 yes. Examples of it. Yeah. So I wrote, I had lots of stuff written, so I took 3 and sent it to Geraldine Kennedy at the time and said, I'm not well, I'm a writer and I write this sort of shite, so would you be interested in publishing it? And I couldn't believe when she emailed me back about 3 days later and said, we'll take 6. Wow. Okay. And I was so thrilled. And so I shaped up my 6 and I sent them in. And of course, when it come to the 4th, 5th and towards the 6th, every day I used to think, what's going to happen next week, They'll miss me. And then I thought, maybe I'll just send one in for the 7th and say nothing, And that's all I did. I just put in number 7 and I waited and it came out. That's grand. It did number 8. And gradually after about 12, I would say, I began to realise that this was going to work, that they were going to keep me on doing it every week.
How many have you done at this stage? Have you any idea?
Well, it'd be around 500.
Wow.
Yeah. So the process then became that the column kind of tells a story every week of just very ordinary stuff, and then that's how it happened. You're asking the question about who, like Hachette publishers came to me,
Right.
and in fact somebody else did as well. I was suddenly popular but particularly Hachette, and particularly I'd say Ciara Durley,
Yes.
as an editor, personally came to me and said, this stuff, you got to do the memoir. So that's how that started.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very astute of them.
Yeah, it was really, and I was thrilled, obviously.
Now, the first one is very much more I know it's not autobiography, it's very different, but it is much more the story of your life, isn't it? It sort of describes when you were a priest, it describes your childhood. And that lovely section at Anna McCarrick, which is a beloved place for me as well.
Yeah.
The second one, which I've actually just read this week, is much more just you and your thoughts, and very different in tone, but equally delicious.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the first one, Staring at Lakes, what really provoked it, which I didn't say because I'd forgotten, but what really, really provoked it, like the column was in the paper, Ciara Durley and Hachette came to me, and that was all grand. But at the time I was doing a one-man show called The Tinker's Curse. I was busy.
Right.
But then I burnt out, and I got exhausted. I ended up physically in hospital with trouble, and when I came out of hospital, I was really in serious depression for about 6 months.
And you wrote about that in the book.
And of course, I decided, well, if what you're doing is storytelling about this ordinary, this nothing that happens, you can't avoid this. You can't do it and not mention that you got sick, because then it's a complete cod.
Sure.
Right? So that ironically meant that just as I was sitting down to do the memoir, I had to really tell the story.
Yes.
I also wanted in the first memoir, Staring at Lakes, to give as much of an overview, because I thought that, again, it's like if I want to tell you that I was in this room listening to Ray Darcy talking to somebody in Florida about orgasms and watching old country people trying to pay attention, if this moment is real, then it has to be reinforced by some overview that I am real.
Yes.
Right? And so I thought I need to tell how I grew up, how I fell in love, and various things that I kind of made mistakes at during my life.
Was it always intended to be more than one, or was it just a success? I mean, the first one, how many weeks was it number one? I mean, it was...
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't know, but it was over a year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very long.
It was incredible.
Yeah. It wouldn't have been number one for over the year at all, but I mean, it
was
certainly was in the top
thereabouts.
3 or 4. Yeah, it just kept coming back. And
Yeah.
It just, I don't know. It was, I think I thought this whole memoir thing became a big idea with me, I don't even see where it ends now.
Sure.
I mean, I'm going to definitely have to stop that memoir and close it. But if I don't die, which I hope I don't, then I'll start again at something like, I have a few ideas to kind of explore almost geographically landscape. I come from Cavan, I talk about Cavan a lot, and I talk about Leitrim a lot, and I talk about Mulgar. But all my life I've lived with a sense of the kind of sacredness of space. For me, when I put my feet on the ground in Arigna, it's just seriously religious for me to do that. And our house is surrounded by hardwood trees that I planted 25 years ago, and now they're enormous, and they shelter you. They put their arms around you. And I look out and I see Loch Allen, and then I see Glangevlin, the top of Quilca Mountain, and I spent my 20s, 3 or 4 years up there, and I just always have had that sense. of that you're in a space, like it's time. You're in time and space, and when you say you're in time, it's a kind of philosophical thing. But the clearest way for it to manifest is to become aware of the space around you, and then you get this strange, extraordinary experience that is called human awareness, which is undefinable. And the more they do stuff like the scientists discovering that, the Higgs boson particle is so tiny that if it was even the fraction lower, mass would have never formed in the universe, and there would be nothing here. And then the more they study the fact that the universe is expanding, we thought it was contracting, it'd be slowing down because of gravity. And now they realize it's actually the expansion of the universe is accelerating at 80,000 miles a second, right? And that idea is there because there's dark matter. And now they think that dark matter is just the kind of matter that's in a vacuum. It's almost emptiness itself. But if that dark matter existed at a fraction different than its wavelength is, there's a vibration of it. And if that vibration it's something like, I think it's like 10 with 100 zeros behind it, millionth of a difference in the vibration. On one end, we wouldn't exist, matter wouldn't form. On the other end, the dark matter would just suck us into destruction in a second. So the whole thing is so balanced. And that's what you get when you stand in my garden. You have to say, it's fucking amazing. Right? It's amazing to be here. It's amazing to be here. There's Martin O'Connor, the box player.
Yes.
I did a gig with him about 2 years ago in Christchurch in Dublin, and he played his first few tunes, and as one normal does, the way the musician says something like, "Thank you very much, it's great to be here." And he says, "Thank you very much, it's great to be here." And then he paused and he said, "In fact, it's great to be anywhere."
Have you by any chance ever done a gig with Mike McCormack?
No.
Because I don't know whether you read his latest book, and the title's just flown away from my head. Help. But he's very. I interviewed him not so long ago, and it was very much that whole sort of thing about. He was saying the chances of you and I being here tonight, and all the things that could have gone wrong. It was all decided at the Big Bang, and by the time we'd finished talking, we both had vertigo.
Yeah. It's too much in those big terms. But that's what's extraordinarily simple about putting your feet on the ground, or breathing, or being here. And I've also felt in life that, that I talk about melancholy. I was always melancholic as a child and all the rest of it. And then, because I had a crisis, I talk about depression. Yeah. But I'm fine. But I'm also fine when I'm depressed. It's like melancholy. And I think I've discovered two things over the past 5 years. One is that I would say 90% of people seem to have the same thing. The amount of people who will say, that happened to me. Yeah. That, in other words, maybe it's not possible to go through life being on the moon all the time, sure, being up in the clouds. There has to be in all of us this sense that there's a dip. And maybe it only comes once in a lifetime, or maybe it comes, in winters or something. But it began to be, for me, the place to explore. That this is a door into, I dare say, the soul, right? In a way that it's good to keep it open, this soul idea,
What I loved, the first book, you're very much exploring spirituality.
Yeah.
The second half of it, you're trying all sorts of things. Whereas the second book, you call it, because it's, this thing of meditating, I've sort of tried occasionally, and there is this thing of how do you stop your thoughts? Yeah. And concentrating on your breathing and having to think about your left toe. I get lost by the time I get to my right toe. I've had it. Yeah. And I love the way that in the second book, you just talk about dozing and about just... It's wonderful. And I was saying to you earlier that you did read something on radio over Christmas, and it was just the most wonderful piece of radio I think I've ever heard. You would just describe that, this thing of dozing.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had the text to that now, but I remember it vaguely. But I do talk, you see, with all this stuff, whether it's New Age or Old Age spiritualities, the very minute you try to grasp it, as far as I understand, you've missed the point. It doesn't. So I don't take meditation seriously. And in Hanging with the Elephant, I'm very irreverent to the whole idea. I'm sitting there describing how the most savagely violent thoughts come into your mind as you're sitting there. You know, you think you're breathing and you're thinking, and I used to go to a Buddhist centre, Jampaling in Cavan, and you'd be sitting there with young fellas, and they'd be as thin as whippets, you know, and with like straight Sally Rod backs, you know, Jesus Christ. And the women would be so vegetarian that you'd be watching them. They'd be there just in a little bit of a light vest, you know, and you'd see them if they took a little slice of an apple, you know, you'd see it going down. And you'd have them shoulder to shoulder, you know, and you'd be sitting there for Thursday afternoon thinking, this is great. I'm happy here. It was nothing to do with meditation, it was to do with the proximity of feminine creatures, you know. It was fucking lovely. And then, I remember, this is a true story too, and I hope you haven't heard it before, because I have said it before, but when I go to this place, and I have it in one of the books, but I'd go to this place, and the first thing, we're sitting all in the circle. I was going to learn meditation, and she said, you know, just get into a nice posture and keep the back straight, and, you know, hold the hands in the right way, and do that. Keep the eyes open now, she'd say, you know, just don't close the eyes. That's not. So just keep maybe just, you know, pick a spot, you know, at the end of your nose, just focus straight on that, and that'll just keep you still, right? So I heard her, she said, pick a spot at the end of your nose. So I went home and I was trying to cross my eyes to actually look at the end of my nose. And I was doing that for about a couple of weeks. And I went back, she said, how's it going one day? I said, it's great. I said, yeah. I said, but I get headaches. And she said, that's a good sign. That's your karma coming out, stuff, you know. I was cross-eyed. So I tell those stories because I suppose I'm trying to say that do nothing. Do nothing. Again, I did an interview with somebody recently for a newspaper, and they were asking me those kind of simple questions, you know, what do you do, where do you come from, what do you do to relax? And I said, I do nothing. Yep. And there was a pause. And she said, like, you know, do you go walking or listen to music or like what? I said, no, I do nothing. And it seemed like a hard concept to take in, that you could actually really do nothing. And I do try to do nothing, and I try hard to do nothing. And I light the fire, and I sit there, and I don't take up a book, and I don't listen to music sometimes, and I just sit there. And I don't even try and meditate. And then you fall into what used to be in the old days called a doze. I'm just dozing, you know. Your granny would be at it in the kitchen, you know, and you'd be trying to get money out of her apron. And she'd be there at the fire in Cavan, in her house, and I'd be trying to get, and you'd always just have the finger just touching the apron, she'd go, leave that alone. Dozing is beautiful because all that stuff in you arises. And sometimes it's like dreams. It's like really, really dreams. Your unconscious starts to function in consciousness. And you have these dreams, and it's like, oh, you see your mom walking, and that's all amazing. And sometimes it's disturbing, and sometimes it's whatever. But I think dozing is a good idea, yeah.
I think we've lost that ability, haven't we? It seems
yeah.
to be that there's this thing of you have to, if you run, you have to do a marathon these days. You can't.
There's an achievement,
yeah. Life with stuff.
Yeah, there's an achievement thing
yes.
going on in all of us that we want to achieve, I suppose. But I don't think, you see, I really think that we're in transition.
Yeah.
And I really think this is a huge thing. You can look at, you can look at the big history. The big history is about Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and all the other orangutans in the world.
Yeah.
But the little history is how you feel when you come out without your glasses. You know, how you feel when you've lost your keys for the fourth time in a week and there's a voice in your head saying you're an idiot, like you always lose them. How do we all feel? And these are stories. These are beautiful stories. So what I believe is, Fintan O'Toole was here last night and he gave a wonderful talk about myth. You know, that history, identity as a nation or a culture is a mythic story. We make up the myth because it works for us. Yes. What's happened at the moment, I think, in Western cultures is that the structures of religion had to necessarily collapse because it was impossible that they could be sustained in the rise of human individuality, freedom, democracy, and feminism. And feminism as the most major 20th century invention of the Western mind, including maybe Marxism and psychiatry. But feminism is this huge, growing consciousness in males and females, and generation after generation. And so it'll come up against these bumps, these orangutans, these people who want to do the absolute opposite to women and put them down and destroy. But really, that's happening because there's a sense of threat. The great white Anglo-Saxon male in the cave is getting really worried and he's rattling the old cage. Yeah. Do you know? And so we're going to a beautiful place. But we don't have myth because we had to let go. You know, it was the baby in the bathwater. And once you have churches that are still controlling stuff, that are still excluding women and all the rest of it, you can't mess with it. Yeah. And people have to exclude themselves, which is a real pity. Not a pity that they're excluding themselves from the church, but it's excluding a pity if they're disempowered from the function of myth in their private lives. For me, myth is like the same as imagination. We would hardly imagine living without imagination. Again, Fintan last night talked about it being the key moment of advancement in human civilization, was this 70,000 years ago we began to actually imagine. We didn't just see the danger of the lion, we could actually imagine the lion scratching his arse. That was an amazing achievement. Now, religion, or what I would say myth, is the same thing. Myth is an imaginative response to the ultimate question of why is there something and why is there nothing. I don't think that, you know, I think that collective religions as kind of formal power structures are gone. They're certainly withering. But I think a time will come when people will rediscover myth in their own individual life. They will still feel blessed as human beings. They will still feel it's amazing to stand in my garden. Even when I'm long gone, the trees will be there and somebody will stand there and say, it's amazing to be here. And they will feel a relationship. The trees are almost mothering them. They'll feel that because this is the cosmos we're in. So I think we're in transition. Right. And I think that's where we get anxious and start to try and achieve, and we put our egos really center. And then I come along like a comedian and think, this is a great crack to tell stories about all this neurosis.
Yeah, but your honesty, is it deciding how honest to be? And I think that is what is so amazing about this. I mean, even just those simple things, if you're in Dublin and you go to the theatre and you're feeling like in Egypt because you're wearing your rain gear and you're imagining everybody's looking at you. Yeah. And all these things that everybody in this room goes through quietly in their heads, but doesn't imagine that anybody else does. And it's very comforting to read that. But was it a decision to write as honestly as that, or is that just you? Is that just
it was just me as a writer, because when I was writing, I wrote a whole trilogy of plays for the Abbey about the clergy. Yeah. I wrote a book called Priest. I wrote a book called Burden to Stone. All those books that I wrote before this.
Was Priest a novel?
Yeah, I didn't even call it a novel. Even then, in 1986, Blackstaff would say it's a novel, and I'd say it's not really. It's a fiction. And it's chopped into little segments. And I said it was a fiction. Because that's as far as I could go. To me, the idea of a novel seemed like a 19th century person, Dickens or Dostoevsky or somebody, or Emily Bronte, and readers reading it as the truth. This was the truth. Even Heathcliff was the truth. Everybody knew, preternatural and strange as he is, that he has grown out of this woman's psyche,
Yes.
and he's extraordinary.
Yes.
It's not a makey-uppy. By the end of the 20th century, the novel had become so used as an art form that it became kind of distant, and it went into genre. And so you could kind of choose, like, I like a Gothic novel, I must get one, because I'm on the train for 3 hours, I could pass the time. Okay? And then, to me, it seemed, I can't do that, but I wouldn't want to do it because I wouldn't be able to, but also because I just want to tell you a story of who I am.
Yeah.
So when I wrote books that were called novels, structurally they weren't quite like a novel, and content-wise they were very close to my private life.
I was actually thinking that. I was reading, actually just the review that I did, and I didn't reread the book of Bird in the Snow. What year was that?
That was about 98 or 97, I'd say.
Right.
96.
And it was a wonderful book. I absolutely adored it. But looking at it compared to the memoir, some of those same preoccupations, it could be possibly, I don't know, based on your mother slightly, I was wondering.
Yeah, again, I mean, Bird in the Snow is a story about an old lady who has a lovely magic to her, and she's fragile, and she's determined to only leave her home in a box. And that's what my mother used to say to me, I'll go out of here in a box. And she had this wonderful energy. And so I wrote a story about an old woman, and she'd go into the town, and all sorts of different things had happened to her. And she had children. I put one boy as a child in it, which is not really me. There'd be little bits of me in it. There really was. I mean, there was a lot of me in it. But basically, it was very much my mother, even though I didn't say that, and I said it as a fiction. And it was my mother when she was alive and strong and feisty. When I came to do the next book, I felt, my journey is
The next book being Staring at Lakes.
Yeah, and I felt my journey is going closer and closer towards, I'll tell you a story, but it is true. It's like there's too much trees wasted making books, or there's too many people in places like Auschwitz, and then wherever else in, Europe, or wherever else in Asia, or wherever else in the next 5 years, or the slaughter that's starting to happen between, in Nice and France and all this. It's like there's an anxiety in us. And we are the people who have, walked without God for the past 100 years. Yes. And it is a liberating walk. I find it liberating. I find it liberating to read Dawkins and to read Grayling, A.C. Grayling people, and to think how beautiful it is that I am alone, that we are alone. Do you know what I mean? Even under the trees, even when you balance yourself between trying to make an imaginative response to this beautiful mystery, and sometimes you just say, you know something, there may not be a response. So there's just being here. And that being here existentially then is just as totally amazing. So for me, the whole human being I am, I'm a storyteller. I can't make it up.
How good has Ireland and the arts and things like Anna McCarrick and I can't pronounce it. You say it for me. You're a member of Astona. How do you say it?
As donkeys. As Astona.
Right. How beneficial has all that support been, or has it been?
I wouldn't be here without it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be here without it. Number one, the Tyrone Guthrie Centre in Anna McCarrick opened in 1981, and when I was finishing my first book, and I had a publisher, and I had people talking, I'd what they call references. So I got into Anna McCarrick, and I felt like the monkey in heaven.
Yes.
I felt I shouldn't be here. They're all posh. All these writers have lovely accents, right? And they keep talking about being, people were saying things like, I haven't seen you since Japan. And somebody else, oh yes, do you know that restaurant in Japan? They do this extraordinary sushi thing. And I was thinking, fuck, I was only getting the hang of spaghetti. I was terrified. And then it went out that I was there was kind of chattering going on, like, do you know your man up there? Oh, he's a priest. He's a priest. Oh, is he? Oh, the bastard. So I was getting kind of a chill.
Yeah.
And into this walked the beautiful woman who, you know, was kind of, I couldn't control myself. I got drunk and I went to bed with her. And
Which is very, that's the one rule there, isn't it? 2 rules. You must have dinner at 7, and you mustn't sleep with a woman or a man.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, you're not
That'd be
allowed
very,
that. Oh,
that'd be very gender specific now. I'd have to complain about that. But no, in the time we were actually in Anna McCarrick, the wild ones, after whom they made the rules.
Ah, right.
The place had only opened because I know that there were 3 marriages came out of romantic liaisons in Anna McCarrick, and ours was one of them, and that was 1984, which is whatever. It's a good few years ago now. Yeah. And we're still together, although she's in Poland all the time. So I'm sorry, but the answer, I couldn't have been a writer without Anna McCarrick opening up the possibility to me, like an educational opportunity. You're entitled to be here as much as anybody else. And when I met Paul Durkin, who was there at that time, and I revered him, and he was just doing the Berlin Cafe, what is it called? The Berlin Wall Cafe. And like, somebody said, Paul Durkin came today, he'll be at the dinner. I was thinking, oh my Jesus, Paul Durkin, you know. I had that kind of sense of awe and all the rest of it. And Durkin would be asking, and what are you writing, and can I have a look at it? And you found yourself being accepted.
Yes.
You found that your prejudices were your prejudices. And you realised that sometimes it's your prejudices that hold you back in life. Not that there's an elite holding you back, but it's your hang-ups about being a culture or being from Cavan. And it was wonderful. Anna McCarrick was a liberation, and I really...
I think there's also that sense, I think I never understood until I went there, that creativity is the same, whatever you are doing.
Yeah.
That you talk to a composer, you talk to an artist, and they would describe why they were writing their piece, why they were painting their painting, and it came from the same place.
Yeah.
And that was, it's probably obvious to everybody in this room, but it was a complete revelation to me.
Yeah.
I've just looked at my watch. We've been talking for an awfully long time.
Have we?
And I think it would be lovely if you did do another reading before we...
Okay.
I could talk to you forever, but I don't think I'm allowed to.
Oh,
so
sure.
if you could perhaps do another reading.
We'd have a couple.
And then...
we'll drink afterwards, like, you know. I'll read another little piece. I don't know what you're laughing at. What time is it? Jesus, and 5 minutes, is it?
Oh, she said we could go on, so don't worry.
It's 5.
As long as you like.
I know, I'll keep it to 5 minutes. What time is it?
It is 7:20.
Right. Get on and read it for me. This is, it's just, I'm dipping into the middle now of this book, talking to strangers. I've been over and back to Bucharest then, in this book, and various things happen. So I go back and forth to Bucharest, and the lady wife does be away in Poland, and I do be depressed. And I go to a therapist. My therapist told me once that there's a child inside me, and when that child feels frightened, I ought to hold him and tell him there's no need to be afraid. How can I hold him if he's inside me? I asked. Use a cushion, she said. Talk to the cushion as if it were the child that you used to be. I found that helpful and not at all difficult, except when other people were around the house, since I wouldn't want visitors to catch me talking to the furniture. When I myself was a child, I used to believe that my guardian angel held my hand when I slept, and I thought that snowflakes were angel feathers that fell from heaven. I told a teacher this one time, but he looked at me and asked me how did I think wet snowflakes could be feathers. Clearly, he said, feathers don't melt. But maybe they fall through the universe, I said. And since the universe is very cold, they might change to ice on the way. He wasn't amused. He said, flakes come from the clouds, you gobshite. But for years I thought of angels every time I saw snow on the roof of a house or on the bonnet of a car. Recently I was standing in the doorway of a church in Warsaw, and I looked up at the sky and realized that the first snow of the afternoon was about to fall. I could see the first flake coming towards me. I stood waiting until it was a full flurry, and then I stood waiting for it to end. There was a young couple sheltering in the porch beside me, and they looked almost surprised to be alive. They too were watching the snow, and their eyes followed the flakes, and they laughed. They seemed to be amazed with the snow, but I think they were probably amazed with each other. And because there were books in their backpacks, I guessed they were probably students. I wanted to go over and say, you're really a lovely couple. But I didn't. I'm not that mad. But I do remember when I was a student, I used to drink hot whiskies in the Roost in Maynooth with an American girlfriend through a particularly long winter of unusually heavy snow. And we would make a song and dance about it, going back up the slushy street to our little flat just beside the Leinster Arms, a flat which I shared with two other male students who also had lovers, who also slept over on Friday nights. It was very crowded. One room. We would drink wine and cider from plastic cups all through the night, and we'd recite hundreds of poems about snow or winter or love from various anthologies that were in our English courses. It was a kind of quiz. We used to pass the whole night doing it. Someone would start, and he'd say, who wrote this? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment, love is not love which alters, when it alteration finds. Who wrote that? And somebody says, Shakespeare. Then somebody would say, a cold coming ahead of it, just the worst time of year. And who wrote that? Say, Eliot. And we passed the night like that. And the rest of us, we'd have to guess the author. And my girlfriend got the identity of a poet right almost 50 out of 50 times, until eventually one of the other boys said, you're some hooer. The exclamation implied that he was positively impressed by her erudition, but to her young American ears, she couldn't have been more disgusted if he had vomited green bile. I tried to explain that Irish people sometimes use the word in conversation as a form of affection or admiration. They call you a hooer. For example, I continued, if a farmer in Cavan grows excessively large and beautiful cabbages, his neighbours would often remark, them cabbages are some hooers. But she wasn't amused, and she stormed out, and I had to go after her. We were on the street in the yellow glow of a street lamp, and I was pleading for her to come back inside, and she was really cross. And then all of a sudden she turned her head up towards the sky and said, oh, look. And I looked, and I saw snow descending. Angels, I whispered, though I was a grown man. And she kissed me suddenly on the lips, and she said, Happy Christmas. As if the snow had changed everything, as if the flakes were angels who could hold us and wipe away all our feelings of sorrow. On the street in Warsaw, 25 years later, I wanted to go over to the young couple and wish them a happy Christmas. But I didn't have the correct Polish words to say happy Christmas. All I could do was go home alone and talk to the cushion on the sofa.
Do we have a roving mic? Do we have a roving mic? Yes? Who would like to ask a question? Come on. Oh, there's somebody. Right, back there.
Hi. Oh, is it on? Yeah. If it's not too intrusive, I just wonder what your wife would say about your melancholy and depression, and also have psychiatry, religion and feminism offered anything in terms of understanding it at all?
I think that I don't think that psychiatry, feminism, Marxism offered me anything. They did offer me something at an intellectual level. You know, you study stuff and it's brilliant. One of the most recent people I was trying to read recently was a woman called Karen Barad, who's a kind of a really, she wrote a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway. She's a Californian feminist, but she uses kind of feminist theory and mixes with quantum physics and stuff, and she really comes up with stuff that even if you can understand half a page, you're really getting something out of it. So those things have really helped me. But more so, I find it's the way it oozes into your skin from just walking around the planet. And that's what makes me hopeful. This is so amazing. So I think that I've absorbed ideas. Do you know the way, there's this thing, we were talking about recently, a day or two ago with some other writer, but the 100 monkeys. Does anybody know that principle? Whereby if you know, a monkey learns to wash the fruit for the fun before he eats it, or she eats it, then gradually it'll pass that on to other monkeys in the group, and after a while they'll all do that. But the most amazing thing that people notice is that when this happens, let's say in Europe, let's say some Carpathian Valley in Bucharest, it will happen virtually simultaneously somewhere, let's say, in South America. That there's a very strong persuasive argument that ideas exist, or ideas that form consciousness exist in some sort of, you know, wide sphere and evolve in ways that we don't quite understand yet. So I therefore think that ideas that people suffered for, ideas that people died in prison for, ideas that, as Pasternak said, we stand on the shoulders of those behind us. And I think that there would be women who came through history in the 20th century, just alone, let's say 19th and 20th century, and their lived experience is part of some dynamic where insight happens. And I'm walking around getting that for free, you know. That's kind of extraordinary, you know. And my daughter gets it for free. And that excites me, you know, that I have a daughter who's in her 20s and who's robust in ways that are the result of context and history, in ways that she hasn't yet. You know, who's Germaine Greer, she says to me one day. Do you know what I mean? Well, that's okay, we'll get to that later. But for now, there's a robustness and in people that they learn or that evolve. And I've learned huge amounts. But that's the way I tend to learn it, because I'm really not intelligent, I'm not an intellectual. My brain can only function at a narrative level. And even when I try to answer your question, I digress all the time into, I want to fucking tell you a story. Because my brain won't work, you know, but I hope that's made some answer. It's a really good question. Yeah. You wanted to know, did I like or loathe the General? Yes. The General is a friend of mine. Like or what? Loathe, yeah. The General is a friend of mine that I've written about regularly over 10 years in the newspaper column. And people regularly ask me, does he exist? And sometimes I say things like, well, I'm not free to answer that question. Or sometimes I say, yes, but his lawyers have been in touch. To go back again to the previous question, you also asked about my wife and how she'd feel about my depression and all the rest of it. You know, I mean, nobody's happy. Sorry? What she was saying about. Yeah. Well, nobody's happy with a bundle of misery hanging around the house. You know, it's a pain in the arse for her, I would say, when I was sick. But there's loads, most of the time I'm quite a cheerful person and I try and entertain her as best I can, with or without glasses. Right? The main thing I always say to people about her is, she's actually never in the books as a personal detail. I've only ever talked about her in a kind of archetypal way, that I am publicly married, I do have a partner, and I try and talk about a man, my feelings as a man for her, my neurosis about her, my needing of her, my unease, all that stuff, without saying what her emotions or ideas or feelings are, because they're private to her. And I'm able to do that without going there. She's a sculptor, and I always say her name, Kathy Carman, in the hope that people will Google it, find her website, look at her work, and realise, okay, she tells her story, because making the human form as she does, as a sculptor, is her narrative. This is visual art versus storytelling. So,
yeah, and you leave your daughter out
almost entirely, yeah. And the General I bring in, and truthfully, the General was completely based on a dear friend of mine who is a wonderful, lovable patriarch. You know, hairs out of his ears, can't stand women on the TV and all that sort of stuff. And when he's in a restaurant, and I've been with him in restaurants, and like years ago, and it was really embarrassing. You know, he's one of these guys, you know, I'm talking like 15 years or 20 years ago, and at that stage he was maybe in his 50s or 60. He was at that position where he felt, I've achieved something in life. And he'd have me at the table in the restaurant, and the hand would go up when he'd want the woman, called then a girl, to come to him. Excuse me, could we have one of your finest ports? And he behaved like that, and I'd be cringing. But over the years, I started sometimes putting in true stories that I couldn't tell about the real person that it happened to. So there's a story, there was a fella on my patio one day, and he took off his trousers to urinate, and he got stung. And he created some scene with his raw backside coming into the house, and us all in the house, about being stung. Now, I couldn't tell that story about him, or for a certain reason. Again, I won't go into it, but he would have been immediately identified. You couldn't resist the story. So I said, the General was at the table one night, and then I tell the story. And so it's totally true, but I had slipped in, I had transposed a narrative into the General, and I do that sometimes. And the man himself now is old, and he doesn't really be bothered, but he'd always great fun with it. In fact, I used to write about him at the time of his sexual prowess, and he'd always chuffed him. You know, I wouldn't be describing encounters, but some of his attempts seemed funny. They seemed kind of Dickensian. I always felt there was a little bit of the Pickwick Papers. You know, the General is out of that kind of Dickensian world, and he's puffed up and he's a bit of a peacock. And I kind of allude to things, you know. But there was one or two guys similar to him who thought it was him. Like, they thought I was writing about them, and they used to be really flattered. And I'd get, there was a particular, this was like 8-9 years ago in Mullingar, and there was one fella, he'd phone me up, you know. How are you doing? Will we meet for lunch? Yeah. I see we're writing about the General again today. And he kind of was waiting for me. Yeah, I know, you're in it. But it wasn't him. So anyway. I worry about my partner. You know, the whole thing of writing personal stuff. Would it be a wrong thing to do? I do worry about that, and I do check it with her all the time. Like she'll read the book. She's reading the book now at the minute, and I was on the phone to her at lunch. You know, and I said, "How's it going?" Like she said, "I'm on page 148, and everything." Where's that in the book? Yeah, okay, yeah. How's it going for you? And it's mostly her in the beginning, and she'd say, "It's fine." She says, "Great crack," you know. So, like, if she said, she knows that if she said, "I really would prefer if you didn't say that," then it would come out next week because she's never done it. But again, I've never actually. It's a subtle way that I talk about his feelings about her. But mostly in the books, she's actually not there. She's away in somewhere doing work. So far so good. And I do enjoy the fun flirtation, because just as it's beautiful to be, let's say, standing under the trees where I live, it's also sometimes beautiful to be standing with a beautiful person beside you. And I say a beautiful woman, but it's not just sexist, because I've stood beside beautiful boys as well, you know, and you just get a tingle of excitement, especially young people, male or female. It's just, for fuck's sake, you see, Jesus. Oh, if I was young now, that kind of stuff. That beauty, sometimes in the columns, I talk about and extend it in a kind of an internal way as to what I might be capable of, right? But again, it's all just, you know, a male fantasy. I don't think it's a male fantasy. I think it's the way the male mind works in their emotions. I think it's worth sharing, you know. And sometimes there was an aunt of my wife's aunt, a conservative woman in Tipperary, and she did phone her up once or twice and said, "Do you know what he's writing on that paper? And who is he seeing in Mullingar?" You know, she thought there was an affair going on. Anyway.
I was just wondering, do you take medication for your depression?
No, but the depression I had 4 or 5 years ago was quite severe, and I chose not to take medication because I felt I was strong enough as a storyteller to really dig in. And my writing of the book Stern at Lakes at the time was my therapy, that and a therapist. But I'm very aware that that's not suitable for loads of other people. So I would always say then that I think sometimes it's a really, really good idea to take medication, even though I haven't. And sometimes I say it's really good to take medication, and then it's also good not to take medication. And it's good to try mindfulness, and it's also good not to try mindfulness. In fact, it's actually what works for you. And within that panorama, you know, medication is there. Now, when I had another bout of this strange melancholy, which was last winter, and it was to do with the fact that I was too long alone on my own up in the house while Lady Wife was away, it also had to do with the fact that I burnt myself out. Now, I did that 5 years ago, but then this year, or last year, I took a job. I was doing a tour of about 20, 30 venues in Ireland, and after it, just after it, I went in to rehearse for The Field in the Gaiety in Dublin, and I was playing the Bull McCabe. It's 2.5 hours on stage every night, twice on a Saturday. You would need to be like Ray McAnally was 40 when he played that part. I was 60, 61, and it was physically too much. Emotionally, creatively, it wasn't too much. But I realised after about 3 shows, I have a physical problem with this. I have no microphone. There's 800 people every night. How the fuck am I going to get through it for a month and a half? Right?
I think burnout and depression are very close, aren't they?
Actually, and that I think that really happened this year, because when I came back to Leitrim, I was fine for about 6 months. I was in the garden, like kind of high as a kite, and then she left, went to Poland for the year, with the knowledge she won't be back till next June, right? And I kind of really got very bleak, physically and emotionally bleak. And at that stage, I went to the doctor, and she said, "What do you think of tablets?" She'd said that 5 years ago, and I said, "No." She said, "What do you think of tablets?" I was so really fed up at this stage. I said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll take whatever you have." She gave me Xanax, or prescribed Xanax, and then I had a friend who's a doctor who prescribed something else and got me something else, kind of under the table, right? Then I had a really moral problem, because I thought, if I take the Xanax and the friend rings up and says, "Did you take my stuff?" Will he feel like I let him down by not taking his tablet? And certainly if I took his tablet and went back to the doctor, improved, she said, "How's the Xanax going?" Would I have to tell her a lie? So I didn't take any. But I used to keep the Xanax in my wallet, and I don't know if they're probably even still in it, because I've never checked, because I got out of it. But I just kept them, and I found, knowing that you had a tablet, that if you got into an intense crisis moment where you felt you were just flooding with anxiety, that you had a chemical way out of it. Yeah. I think that's it was good to have them in the pocket, I think.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
You're a terrific audience. He's amazing, isn't he? So a very big hand for Michael Harding.
Thanks very much. Okay. We go, we do.